I am Tom Wenzel. I am with the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and the reason I'm here today is to kind of share with you some things that are currently in place regarding our wetland banking program, regarding some of the technical changes that we are planning on implementing in the near future, as well as talk a little bit about some of the programs that we are running and administering, and to talk a bit about some technical resources we have available, and then also to get into some of the crux of some of the design and construction requirements and some miscellaneous discussion topics as it relates to that I think may be of some value to you. So just out of curiosity, who in the audience, and I know there's a number of you, but who is really involved in wetland banking, developing wetland banking projects for landowners? Maybe about half or so? Okay, great. So some of the stuff that I'm going to present today, you may have seen a little bit at the conference a couple weeks ago. Dan Shaw did present on portions of this, so I'll try not to bore you too much with some overlap here. But so as we said, Bowser has a strong restoration legacy with wetlands and different programs. In particular, we have our Rim Reserve program, which has been around since 1986, and we have well over 5,000 restored wetlands that have been completed as part of that program. Well over 50,000 acres of restored wetland as part of that. And for those of you that aren't aware, the governor just did sign a week and a half ago a new Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program agreement with Farm Service Agency in Washington. We will be doing another 60,000 acres of permanent easements over the next 6, 7, 8 years as part of that, and a little over half of those acres are going to be attributed to more wetland restoration, all done for conservation purposes. These are all outside of the mitigation arena. So the mitigation side, we have our wetland banking program, as you know, and it deals both with public road banks as well as our private wetland banks. So within these programs, we've got a broad range of experience of different types of wetland systems that we're restoring. We got a lot of shallow lakes that we've done, wetland wildlife complexes, wild rice paddies, sod farms, and currently working on restoring an abandoned golf course up in Andover right now. And as Dan mentioned at the conference, we have recently developed the Minnesota Wetland Restoration Guide. It's an updated guide from a document that was originally done years ago. I forget the year. And it's a comprehensive document. It covers everything from planning and design all the way through site selection and long-term management of sites. And if you're looking for it, you need to go to our website, get on our wetlands page, and it's right where I've got it circled there where you can find it. And this is kind of our cover page for the guide, and it's got 6 sections in it. We've got an introduction, a section on identifying and planning a project, a section on site assessment, engineering, design, and construction, vegetation establishment, and monitoring and management. So I'm going to focus a little bit on section 4 of the guide and some of the components that are associated with that. The section itself has good information in it about dealing with drainage systems, dealing with outlet structures, dealing with embankments, shallow scrapes, a lot of construction stuff that's in there. There's a whole section or a chapter in there that discusses some of the legal issues associated that we run into when we restore wetlands, both in terms of land rights and drainage law and permits, etc. But I think what probably is going to be most helpful to folks as they're using this as a resource tool is maybe some of the appendices that we have created to go along with it. So one of those is what we call Appendice 4A1, and it's about strategies for blocking and filling surface drainage ditches as part of restoration projects. 4A2 is very similar, but it's about blocking subsurface drainage tile. Then we have an appendix on outletting upstream drainage systems into wetlands that we're planning on restoring. We have a whole guidance document on when we can't outlet drainage systems because maybe they're not high enough in elevation to do so, about what considerations you might need to have if you want to reroute something away from or around a wetland that you're planning on restoring. Then we have a section, or a guidance document I should say, on considerations for dealing with lift stations that might be present as part of a drainage system. So what we are still working on is another set of appendices for section 4 that deal with typical types of outlet structures that are commonly used when we're restoring wetlands. So these are all at various stages of completion. We do not have them published yet and put on the website, but we hope to have that done soon. And then we also have some standard design drawings, and I know a few of you have already utilized some of the details from these. These are referenced out of the website to our engineering page on the website. And essentially we have just a bunch of 11 by 17 details, both in CAD and a functional PDF format for anyone to grab and utilize if it works for you. And again, we're constantly updating a lot of these documents, in particular these standard drawings, so if you are using them, I would encourage you to check back on them for updates to make sure you got the latest and greatest stuff as it's available. All right, so some of the regulatory program changes that are coming as it relates to kind of more the technical side of things in terms of design and implementation. You know, there's a lot of complaining from folks right now that the Wetland Conservation Act and the Core 404 don't necessarily line up very well in terms of our procedures and possibly some of our policies. So we are working hard to try and get them to line up better. There's a number of things that are in play right now that helps us get there. One of which is an engineering MOU that we signed, I believe, just over a year ago that provides for Bowser to provide engineering review, in this case me, of all of our mitigation sites on behalf of 404 and WACA. So instead of having two agencies providing the engineering technical side of review, it's just going to be me doing it on behalf of the WACA and also on behalf of the IRT. So we've got kind of one common voice there in terms of that, and so it's working out really well from my perspective, I think. We also are making strides to come up with more similar language on a lot of our stuff. For example, now through WACA, we have kind of adopted some of the core language on the process. We are now using prospectus, for example, to replace what used to be concept plan for us. And so we're trying to line up some of the language things as much as we can to make life a little bit simpler for everybody. We are in the process right now of working with the Corps on some new standard forms for the scoping document or the pre-prospectus, as well as the prospectus and then the application itself. So it's going to be a little bit different than what we've had out there in the past. The scoping and prospectus aren't going to change that much from what I understand. Maybe a little bit better language changes, but we think the application document is going to be modified considerably, a little bit more informative in terms of what our expectations are within each of those different sections, instead of just asking some general questions of the applicant or you consultants who are preparing this on behalf of applicants. It's going to be a little bit more detailed in terms of what our minimum expectations are, maybe possibly checklists on certain categories with it, so you've got a much clearer understanding of what it is we need to see or want to see within regard to each of those different specific components of a bank application. And there's additional stuff coming, and I don't want to get too much into it, but some of the things I can share with you is we are in the process of a WACA rule change right now. We are reconciling our rule to be in line with some of the law changes from 2011, 12, and 2015 more recently. Some of those changes are likely going to include a modified, improved list of requirements and processes for wetland replacement. Trying to be more clear on what it is that we are expecting to come in with applications. And maybe the bigger thing here is adjusting LGU responsibilities relating to the approval process. We are trying to head down the path where Bowser will now be making decisions on wetland banks instead of our local LGUs in terms of them being approved or not. LGUs will still have a role to some extent on these projects, but the actual decision making in terms of does it meet the rule, is it acceptable to the state, can we take an easement on it, we are hoping as part of this rule change will become the ownership of Bowser instead of a bunch of different LGUs out there. So we think that in itself is going to be a big improvement over the program, provide a little bit more consistency in terms of how we are doing things and be more in line with the court, our partner on a lot of these projects, so we can provide better service. So as it relates to design and construction, some of those changes, as I said earlier, we are going to try to have more clear submittal requirements, so there's less question or ambiguity in terms of what we need to see. I'm hoping that we are going to be developing some minimum design standards, so we've got a better document for you folks to reference to know exactly how you should be designing projects and what it is we're going to want you to try and achieve in terms of those outcomes. And we are likely going to be taking a little bit stronger role in terms of project certification. In my opinion, one of the things that we kind of fall short on with a lot of projects is we get real involved in the design and review of applications, and we basically turn a blind eye and let consultants and landowners go out there and build something, but we never follow up in terms of the agencies as to what actually got done. Our LGUs may go out and look at them, but they don't often have a trained technical eye to a lot of the details. So I think as part of Bowser taking over the approval process on these projects, we're also going to step up a little bit in terms of the certification side of it and have a presence on site, whether it be during or after construction, help with that final certification of completion and make sure we've got what was promised in terms of components that are completed on a site. So those are some big things that I think are going to help. Talking to Tim Smith, our bank program manager, he did indicate to me that they are intending to do some outreach training sometime this spring regarding a lot of what I just covered, but certainly it'll go into much more detail on that. He wanted me to share that with you folks. So no details on that yet, but they are talking about it extensively, and we're hoping that we'll have more information to share with you then in a bit more detail than what I'm giving you now. So let's talk a little bit about the wetland mitigation process. As you know, we have the first step, which is what we refer to as the scoping or pre-prospectus. And we have the prospectus stage, the final application stage, and then we've got implementation, certification, crediting, and then our long-term monitoring. So along with that, I put some slides together that kind of summarize what I think our goal is for our wetland banking projects. And one of them is to be self-sustaining and meeting program requirements and defined project goals. So to get that, there is a regulatory review process. And that process does have some purpose and goals attached to it. I think some of our purposes are an oversight responsibility for the programs that are involved. Because of that, we have an oversight responsibility for the projects that are developed. And we have a responsibility for easement conveyance and then long-term enforcement of those easements as part of that. So some of the goals that we have are to promote and encourage restoration of high-quality, sustainable wetland banks that are attached to a perpetual conservation easement. And perpetual is an awful long time. So we have some things in our rule and in the federal rule between our two programs that I think are kind of important to understand. One is, one of our subparts within WACA rule says our replacement projects must be located and designed to the maximum extent practicable to be self-sustaining once performance standards have been achieved. So you're going to see that sustainability and self-sustaining thing a lot in our two programs. So to get there, we as agencies want to provide comprehensive valued comments and findings and decisions to applicants, and we want to be consistent with our program rules and our guidance. One of our goals is to ensure that all project elements are appropriately designed and implemented using sound, sustainable design and construction strategies. We want to reduce project risk and limit long-term maintenance, because there's potentially a large long-term cost for all of us to address problems that result from poor decisions that get made. So I did a little bit of querying before this presentation with some folks just to get a sense of what it is they thought I should talk about. And instead of getting into a lot of technical detail about how and what we want to see things designed, I think the general consensus was maybe talk about some of the issues that we are seeing in relation to stuff that is submitted, whether it just be design-related issues or issues that might be a result of some of the program requirements or some of the policies that we have out there in terms of how it affects some of the decisions that we're making in terms of design and restoration outcomes. So I did my best at trying to come up with a list of things, and so part of it is, one of the big things I think is restoration goals in terms of how are they defined and how do we measure success on these projects. So you look at the federal rule, and it gives a pretty good definition of restoration, basically with the goal of returning sites back to their natural historic function. And the WACA rule has a very similar definition of what restoration means, and that wetlands should emulate the hydrology and vegetation of the pre-settlement wetland condition. So therefore, with few exceptions, the former wetland type or extent should be the target or goal for our restoration projects. And that all sounds great, but we all know that there's an awful lot of gray area in between there in terms of what sounds good in terms of a goal, in terms of what we can really do out there on the landscape. So you look at the current core district policy for wetland compensatory mitigation, and it does say that restoration is their preferred mitigation technique, but it also says that bank site designs consisting of ponds, impoundments, or deep marshes will be rejected during the IRT process with limited exceptions. They're basically telling us that the deep marsh type restorations that are being proposed out there really don't have a great need in terms of accrediting, and I think it's causing a lot of problems in terms of understanding what this means, as well as how do we apply that on the landscape in terms of functional sites. So it's saying that compensation consisting of open water ponds, impoundments, and/or deep marshes is no longer acceptable as a standard practice, except when it would constitute an in-kind compensation in a particular case, not be practicable to establish any other wetland types due to landscape position and contributing watershed, and/or constitute 15% or less of the acreage of the bank site. So what they're telling us is there currently isn't a great need for this type of credit. Okay, now there may be 5-6 years from now, but we really don't know that with banking projects. So I think what I'm going to try and demonstrate to you as consultants and others is the approach we need to take in terms of looking at projects. Because I think what's happening is it's steering people in the wrong direction in that particular policy. So for example, we have a former deep marsh wetland setting, and it's currently drained by a ditch, maybe some tile. And because of that policy, we have applications that are coming in trying to develop something out there that is consistent with that policy, but not consistent with what the site used to be in terms of restoration, in terms of wetland type. So we kind of have two conflicting things that are happening here in terms of trying to comply with the policy, to develop wetland credits that are more in line with what the Corps says we need right now, but we're trying to work with landowners who have an interest, and we have wetland types that are drained that don't fall in line with that. Therefore, we're trying to do something different out there than maybe what is best suited for that site. And it puts us in a tough spot in terms of review and providing valuable comments, because there's lots of stuff in our rule and in the federal rule that basically says, well, this isn't restoration. You're not restoring it back to the historic hydrology regime. You're doing something completely different here. Therefore, should it even be allowed as a bank project? So these are some tough questions, and we thought it'd be good to maybe talk about that a little bit. So part of it is, what is the policy intent? Certainly not to drive a square peg into a round hole, but I think we've got to read some of the exception language maybe a little bit more carefully in terms of what is really being applied here. It says it must not be practicable to establish any other wetland type due to landscape position and or contributing watershed. So I think if you have a shallow marsh setting, and it makes most sense to restore a shallow marsh or even a deep marsh setting back on that landscape, then that's what you ought to be proposing, instead of trying to propose something else that really doesn't work well or fit well. And you need to, do a little homework, I think, working with your local PM in terms of trying to justify a need for this type of credit in this watershed, and make sure that you are heading down the right path in that regard. But clearly, you read this language, and it doesn't say that you can't restore these types of wetlands. I think the Corps right now is just trying to discourage it because there's not a big need for these type of credits, across the board in the state right now. And but it gets tough because this flies right in the face of what we're trying to do in terms of restoration. And we all know there's a limited number of sites out there where we have interested landowners. And if it was a shallow to deep marsh setting, then maybe we really need to be thinking about that as an outcome on the thing instead of trying to do something different here. So I would argue that for that same site, this might be a better project. Yeah, a little bit more construction work maybe by rerouting that ditch around the wetland, but we do get the whole wetland back. The hydrology may not be the same as it was pre-drainage. Obviously, everything to the south is now going to get cut off by that rerouted ditch, but who knows what other changes have occurred in that watershed from a hydrology perspective, and we still may be able to achieve a very functional restoration project here and get much of what was here historically back as part of this approach compared to the prior one. So there is, in this case, there's a little existing wetland up in the northeast corner. I don't know what that is. I just grabbed an air photo off of Mintopo here, and should that or should that not be part of the project? I mean, that's to be decided once more information can be known about that. And as I said, would there be adequate hydrology to support this type of restoration with that ditch system running along the south edge and maybe cutting some of its historic watershed off? Possibly. That's certainly something that's got to be looked at. But what if restoration of that full basin is impossible? Let's just say, for example, everything south of that east-west running ditch is owned by a different landowner and they want nothing to do with this particular project, and the landowner on the north side wants to still do something. But given the limited area that you have to work with, you can't restore a deep marsh setting. You're left with something less than that in terms of hydrology. What do we do? How do we treat that? And these are tough questions, and I've asked a number of folks who are managing these programs right now, and no one has a real direct, clear answer on that. So I think the questions to be asked really are, can something sustainable be accomplished out here, and can it be argued that if we can do that, we have something good enough to put into a program and serve as mitigation? And I think once you phrase it in those terms, I think most people will generally agree and say, as long as it's close and as long as what you come up with is sustainable and not wild and crazy in terms of construction elements, then make an argument for it and you'll probably be successful. Okay? The question is going to get to be, though, on a site like this, there's a ditch running along half of that wetland, and will that ditch continue to have a lateral effect component on that wetland? Will it prevent that wetland from being fully functional? Or how much construction is going to need to be done to separate that hydrology in the wetland from that ditch? And is all of that work going to be sustainable forever? So these are the tough questions that we wrestle with, and I'm sure you do as well as you're looking at potential sites. From a review perspective, these are big issues for us, and it's tough. It's tough to come up with good, consistent responses back, and it's hard to say no. But I think there are times that we need to, and this is why we have that three-step process, so we can vet some of these issues out early before a lot of resources are invested in sites with the full application. We hope we can get all this taken care of through scoping, or at worst case, the prospective stage, and get you all steered in a better direction. In addition, just for the fun of it, I was asked to maybe talk a little bit about easement boundaries, and so I just threw it on this one example. Is this adequate buffer for a wetland, assuming we could restore this wetland? And is this an enforceable easement boundary? And most people in our agency would say no. This is a buffer simply based on some minimum consistent width around the wetland edge, and straighter lines, a more practicable boundary that would be more enforceable, would be something that is what we would require. So on the flip side, we don't see it quite as much anymore, but there's still a long history here of folks who want to take a former wetland that may have been a wet meadow, for example, and build an embankment or overbuild an embankment to get more hydrology on that site than perhaps what used to be there, and for the purpose of trying to get a larger wetland area on the landscape, which in turn might result in more credit for the applicant. So again, these are things that we are trying to be very careful with in terms of, is this really meeting restoration intent? Is this really putting wetlands out there that we need in terms of mitigation? I'm not so sure. So then, how do we find restoration success? Certainly sites where we have sustained hydrology and high functioning wetlands. Sites where we have met targeted wildlife species or vegetation communities. Where we have well-designed and sustainable restoration features. And sites that meet policy and they're agency approved, and we get credits and sales from that, and everybody's happy, right? So, the next thing I kind of want to talk about is the submittal process, and maybe just a few pointers in terms of what it is that we are seeing in terms of recommendations to make things go maybe a little bit better. And as I said, we are in the process of redoing all the forms and all the requirements that go with these submittals, so I think that in itself is going to help. But, again, a lot of this is from others, but provide